seems, doesn't it, that we now live in a world where everybody gets offended on everybody else's behalf. You might take this dispute about Uber a little more seriously if the overwhelming bulk of Uber drivers were saying, oh, God, I hate doing this work. I loathe the way that Uber treats me. I mean, some think they should be treated as employees, but the backlash isn't really coming from the workforce itself. And if you look at opinion polls and studies into people who are working in the gig economy, the suggestion is that the workers themselves greatly value the flexibility, meaning, they can, if you're an Uber driver, you can take a day off at a second's notice. You don't need to book your annual leave. Or similarly, if you really want to save up for something, you can decide to dial up your hours.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes. We're the channel that asks you to think more and follow less. On today's show, I'm absolutely delighted to be talking about I think, relatively controversial topic, even though in my view it shouldn't be. But I'll just give you a little bit of background before I introduce today's guest. So, having been warned that they'd face no choice but to pull out of California entirely, Uber and Lyft recently won temporary reprieve from orders to reclassify their drivers as employees rather than independent contractors. A court ruling on the legal challenge issued earlier this month, August, ordered the companies to abide by California's Assembly Bill 5 law, which forces companies to classify their drivers as employees, along with the benefits that come with that classification, like minimum wage, healthcare, and holiday pay. Now, Uber faces similar such reckonings on two fronts, no fewer than two fronts here in the UK. It's weeks away from a battle against Transport for London over a decision not to renew its licence. That appeal was delayed thanks to COVID-19, and that's based around claims that Uber isn't a fit and proper operator in their eyes. The company then awaits the decision on its appeal at the Supreme Court over how it classifies its drivers in Britain. Now, I'm delighted to say that joining me to discuss the Uber ruling in California and the upcoming one here in London and what the repercussions are for the gig economy and consumers here in Britain is Mark Littlewood. Now, Mark is Director General of the Westminster-based think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, and host of the YouTube sensation Live with Littlewood. Hello, Mark. How are you doing?
I'm great. It's good to see you, Darren.
Yes, you too. Now, how's your lockdown been, Mark?
Well, I've just about adjusted to living in a dystopian communist society. It's taken a while, but I've got there. I think most of us have. It's pretty amazing how humans adapt. The sooner the lockdown now comes to an end, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. Now, listen, Mark, you've argued in the past that buccaneering technology that's behind the sharing economy, for which Uber is very much, I think, still the poster child, it's crushing or has crushed the ability of Whitehall mandarins and others to direct, or policymakers to direct and dictate our lives. Now, that might be infuriating for them, but that's good in your view, isn't it, for the rest of us?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. I think Uber, you're right, Darren, is at the, I don't know if it's the poster child, but it's definitely at the coalface. It's probably the most controversial part of the gig economy. It's a controversial company, a buccaneering company. I think what's happening, and it's around drivers that this battle's being fought, but I think we'll see this battle opening up on other flanks as well before long, is it's increasingly difficult to define what working for someone is, because technology is now allowing more and more people to have sort of portfolio careers. We've moved on enormously from the kind of caricature of back in the day. You'd join a company at 16, work until you retired at 65, be given a carriage clock at the end of it, and you might only work for one company for your life. Things like Uber and the gig economy in general means that you can be much more transactional in your work. So you might be an Uber driver 3 days a week, a security guard a couple of nights a week. Maybe you also run a market stall on Saturdays. People are moving to being much more, if you like, directly plugged in to their customers, their consumers, rather than having the interlocutor of a company. And you're completely right that this bamboozles Whitehall mandarins. What happens when you get disruptive technologies, almost of any kind, is that those people whose job it is to put us in a particular pigeonhole, these people are employed, these people are self-employed, or indeed anything else. This is the definition of a cigarette, this is the definition of an e-cigarette, this is the definition of a pharmaceutical product. Those pigeonholes become near impossible, really. And I think that the difference between being self-employed and employed has been breaking down a lot. But Uber really drives a coach and horses through that, or more likely a Mercedes-Benz as it's Uber. So it's really the whole nature of work and employment and remuneration for people's labour is changing radically. And I can't really see, whatever the outcome of these particular court battles are, how the regulatory state can catch up or ever redefine work in a way which would be neat and tidy in the eyes of a Whitehall central planner.
Well, I mean, we mentioned the sort of command from the centre and control over other forms. There are a few trade unions, for example, which are very much invested in ensuring Uber cannot operate in the UK, for example. But why do you think that is? What explains that? You mentioned the fact that the sort of the way in which we all work is changing beyond recognition. Is this just a sort of Luddite assault on newer ways of working, on the self-employed and working in general? What do you think explains this?
Okay, I think there's a few forces behind it, and let's start by taking the best view of people who might disagree with you and I, who are going to approach this from a free market perspective. I think you can put a case that if certain work comes with it a whole batch of rights, and you might argue whether those rights should exist or not, of minimum wages, sick leave, annual leave, maternity pay, paternity pay, all of that sort of thing. If you're getting that by being, let's say, a driver for Addison Lee, why should something different apply because you're a driver for Uber? Why is the Uber driver taking the risk that they might not make minimum wage? Now, you and I might just say, well, choose to work for Addison Lee if you don't like Uber, or choose to get a stable, predictable job with that bag of and batch of rights with it. But you can see people saying, well, if it applies to X, why doesn't it apply to Y? These are extraordinarily similar ways to make a living, and therefore they should come with extraordinarily similar regulation, laws, benefits, rights, duties and responsibilities and the rest of it. That, I think, is the, if you were to take as I say, the best view of people who disagree with free marketers on that, you could say that. And then I think there's actually just good old-fashioned protectionism, right? I mean, if you are a licensed hackney cab driver in London, Uber is not good news for you. The same has happened in a lot of cities across the globe, where you would have a limited number of medallions in New York are issued to people who are then licensed cab drivers. Nobody else is allowed to put his charge, or at least to pick up on the street. Those people who've got those golden tickets, well, you've restricted supply, so their prices go up. And Uber is obviously eating away at the traditional cab market. So I think you tend to get people saying, well, we want to keep out the competition. And sometimes I'm a little cynical when people say, oh, it's all about the safety of the passenger and all of the rest of it. I'm not saying there's no truth in that, but it's a little bit like the dispute I think we've had on Southern Rail. We're asked to believe that the guards and the RMT care not safety, at all for themselves, their remuneration or their jobs and security. They care only about me as a passenger and my safety. And sometimes I take that with a bit of a pinch of salt. So I think those are the two things underlying it. But then the third thing, Darren, is if you look at, which we already touched on, if you look at the world through the eyes, through the mind, through the psychology of a regulator, of a central planner who likes government and the state to put things in boxes and then apply specific rules to different boxes, well, Uber presents you a real problem. Is this self-employment? Is this freelancing? How do we categorize it? And I rather welcome that the gig economy as a whole, I prefer to call it the gig economy. The sharing economy doesn't really mean anything. The economy as a whole is about sharing and trading. But the gig economy as a whole is smashing up all these boxes. I mean, Airbnb would be another example. In the minds of a regulator, is Airbnb an estate agent, a chain of hotels, a landlord? You know, what sort of statutes and regulations and which agency should regulate it? And all of these disruptive technologies cause major headaches for people who like to see the world in that pigeonholed, regulated sort of way. And by and large, I consider that to be a very good thing indeed.
Now, I mean, if we read out the statement that Uber gave to London's Evening Standard, it says, "We are glad that the Court of Appeals recognised the important questions raised in this case and that access to these critical services won't be cut off while we continue to advocate for drivers' ability to work with the freedom they want." Now, it's the latter part of that sentence that I focus in on the most, Mark, because is this the case? It's the freedom that the drivers themselves want. If this is the case, why are campaigners fighting for rights that might hinder those Uber drivers from being able to actually maximise the flexibilities and not take those trade-offs that would, prevent them from having those flexibilities?
Very good question, Darren. And look, it seems, doesn't it, that we now live in a world where everybody gets offended on everybody else's behalf. You might take this dispute about Uber a little more seriously if the overwhelming bulk of Uber drivers were saying, "Oh God, I hate doing this work. I loathe the way that Uber treats me." I mean, some think they should be treated as employees, but the backlash isn't really coming from the workforce itself. And if you look at opinion polls and studies into people who are working in the gig economy, the suggestion is that the workers themselves greatly value the flexibility, meaning, they can, if you're an Uber driver, you can take a day off at a second's notice. You don't need to book your annual leave. Or similarly, if you really want to save up for something, you can decide to dial up your hours. I'm going to work a long week this week, and I'm going to work at peak hours and really bring home the bacon. So your ability to dial up and dial down is something that the drivers themselves really seem to like. And I was looking at a couple of surveys as well. The Paris School of Economics and INSEAD looked into the sort of psychological well-being of workers and drivers, and gig economy workers are about 33% more likely to self-report positive mental health traits. A study in 2018 from the Oxford University School of Economics and Management looked at sort of life satisfaction. Now, I know all these are slightly vague things that you're asking people to self-report on, but they found higher levels of life satisfaction amongst gig economy workers than other workers. So it does seem on the face of it a choice that people can take, and you can understand at different points in people's careers or family life. Or I've spoken to a couple of Uber drivers who are trying to set up their own business in completely different areas, but until they get their business off the ground, they want to have some sort of dependable income stream, even if it's modest. All of this seems to suit, really, customers who, customers of Uber seem to rate it very highly. In fact, it's basically put being chauffeur-driven around cities within the reach of only the modestly well-off middle class. It's no longer a ridiculous luxury to be driven home from work in a Mercedes-Benz. The workers seem to like it, but the politicians, the regulators, and to some considerable degree the incumbents don't like it at all. But in terms of where the tide of history and technology is going, whatever the outcome in California or London, this general trend to smashing up what we used to understood as a working life, I think is unstoppable. And I think from what we can see so far will be to the great benefit of both workers and consumers for the reason that you said, Darren. It gives you much more choice and much more flexibility. And you as a worker can suddenly decide to work a bit harder this week or not so hard the week after, according to your particular needs at the time. What a joy. That's something that my parents' generation could never have dreamed of.
Beautifully put. But Mark, isn't the problem here that some people have with Uber is that by not classifying its workers as employees, Uber can avoid, for example, paying hundreds of millions of dollars into US state employment insurance schemes. And yet during COVID, for example, it was able to lobby the federal government to step in and pay its drivers unemployment benefits. Is this not a form of, avoiding paying its fair share?
Really good question, and it's quite complex. I know more about the British system around national insurance and social security than the American system, but I'm sure the basic same principles apply. And it's not as if, for example, in the UK during the coronavirus pandemic and lockdown, we've only given support to people who are registered as full-time workers rather than self-employed. We've also provided support to the self-employed. So you can argue about which box you should go into. What I'd like to see is that these sort of government interventions are based on whether and how much you were paid into the scheme. And I think I would actually make national insurance an option for workers, either if they're in full-time contracted employment or if they're self-employed. If you want to pay into an insurance scheme, you can. And then when something bad happens, you get sick, you get ill, you lose your job, there's a pandemic from a wet market in China, you can claim against it. I think it's a bit strange that you're put into either category according to some regulatory diktat or some statutory way of defining how you make your living. So I'd liberalise that almost completely. Look, it's unsurprising there, and I'm not suggesting Uber is going to act any differently to any other company. Big, powerful companies lobby for their interests, and you can expect Uber to be going to the federal government saying we need money and support for this. You can expect yellow cab drivers in New York to be arguing for something else. People act in their own narrow financial interests. Uber's no different. But the solution here is just to change the way we do social insurance, to make it something that you can pay into, whether you are an employee or a freelancer. I think that would actually make sure we had an even playing field. And just like you decide whether you take out contents insurance or full car insurance or travel insurance, you could also decide what insurance you want to take out against the loss of earnings.
How can we actually improve the lives of those in the gig economy who might, not be earning enough to get by? Are there any policy interventions that you would like to see, or would you just like the government to get out of the damn way?
I think getting the government out of the damn way is the policy improvement I'd like to see, right? I mean, I think that if you work with the grain of new technological innovation, especially if the signs are overwhelmingly that it's a benign development, and as I say, more people are able to get around in Uber. It's cheaper than a black cab. Certainly, okay, I'm on a very good middle class salary, but I now get driven around more than I would if Uber didn't exist, because it's more affordable than me taking a black cab between A and B. So I think the best thing is to work with the technology. Now, there is an interesting point here which goes to this court case, is if we're going to keep all of the labour regulation we presently have on the statute books, and I'd rather we liberalised a lot of these laws, at what point, if I'm not going to get my first best world and regulatory utopia and all of the employment laws written by M. Littlewood, at what point are we going to define people as workers as opposed to self-employed? Now, I think that, as I said earlier, that pigeonholing is nearly impossible because there's just now so many grey areas. But it's an interesting question. And I would have thought, if you're arguing that Uber drivers are employees of Uber, because, and usually the argument is because they're dependent on the Uber platform for their business. If that suddenly went down or was switched off, they wouldn't be able to transact.
Which I really don't think is the case now, by the way. I think there are so many apps that I've seen Uber drivers switch between 3 of them.
Yeah, I agree with you. So there's actually now competition for the workers as well. So you could be running Uber and Lyft and,
exactly.
Is it Halo? Is that
Captain? There are loads of them.
You can run more than one. But the argument goes that if you're sort of dependent upon the platform or dependent on some entity in order to facilitate your work and your remuneration, then you're an employee rather than a freelancer. But let's just think about where that might end. I mean, let's imagine someone, and I don't think this requires an enormous leap of imagination, it's a rather plausible scenario, somebody who's not making a great living, perhaps is a pensioner, so got a pension to fall back on, but makes some money by selling knickknacks on eBay, right? So you're putting some, stuff from your attic on eBay to try and sell these knickknacks to people at £1 a time, £5 a time, or whatever. Well, you're dependent upon the eBay platform to sell those knickknacks. If the eBay website goes down, you would have to find a completely different way to sell them. You'd have to go to a car boot sale or some such like, or advertise them in a shop window. So are eBay sellers employees of eBay? If you sell your unwanted old toys, knickknacks and clothes on eBay, should eBay ensure that you make the minimum wage, even if nobody buys any of these knickknacks? Should they cut you a check when you fall ill because you can no longer list these things you're selling? So I think it's extremely difficult, even if you are trying to use, which I understand is the argument behind it, this is the worker, is the person who's using their labour dependent in somehow on a platform, wholly dependent on it. But I think that even breaks down. I mean, not just for the reasons you've given, Darren, on they may very well be wired up to several apps that put them in touch with passengers, but if Uber, why not eBay? And why not, almost any online platform? I mean, if you're the person who owns a plot of land that you rent out on Saturdays to market traders, are those market traders now able to come after you?
And then it starts to get really granular, and you start to discuss things like, if someone's writing a blog, I don't know, on Facebook, is Facebook going to pay them the minimum wage for their blog? Or it starts to
or
get
if you're
into
monetized on YouTube. If you're monetized on YouTube, nobody watches your video. You go to YouTube and say, I still like the minimum wage for that. Thanks very much. So I'm dependent on your platform. So I think all of that will unwind quite quickly. You can see on Uber and other sort of app devices like Uber around driving why they're at the coalface, because people are sort of saying, look, this is indistinguishable between black cabs or a mini cab service. Just, the fact that it's just something you do on your mobile phone by tapping an app shouldn't mean it's treated any differently than using your mobile phone to phone a mini cab firm. But actually, I think it unravels quite quickly, because if Uber is a platform you're dependent upon, well, we're basically going to get rid of most self-employment. And what I think we're going to see, it's a prediction, and I'm not an economic forecaster, so I make this prediction with several buckets of salt, but it seems to be the trend that we're going in. I think we're moving towards a world in which, before too long, maybe a generation or so, basically everyone will be self-employed. That rather than my successor being Bill Bloggs, the Director General of the IEA, with a full-time contract with the IEA signed by the company and signed by him, is more likely to be Bill Bloggs Consulting and paid on a kind of part work basis, a bit by bit work basis for what he does for the IEA, perhaps taking a Thursday or a Friday off to do something different, to write a column for a newspaper or run a YouTube channel or something. So what this technology is doing is actually just allowing us to, and I guess this is why it's called the sharing economy, but allowing us to share more and deploy both human labour and capital resources much, much more efficiently. Yeah. It's not just affecting the world of work, it affects fairly low-scale capital deployment. I mean, when I was a lad, absolutely everybody on my street had a wheelbarrow and a lawnmower, despite the fact that you'd only use the lawnmower, I don't know, once a week for an hour, and a wheelbarrow once a month for an hour. Now, because it's so easy to wire you up to other people, you don't really need to own these things yourselves. I mean, you don't really need to own a car yourself anymore. So we've got much, much better at deploying capital efficiently and labour efficiently, because we can instantaneously match things up thanks to the onward march of technology. And that leaves the old style sort of 1960s, 1970s regulatory state around taxation and the labour market in tatters. And overall, I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely. And even using space more efficiently, right? Which helps a lot when we've got a severe housing crisis in this country and people are having to live in smaller and smaller accommodation, especially in London. But Mark, I wonder if to end, I might ask you if you would be able to put your thinking cap on and get a little bit, I don't know, creative for a second. And tell us what you think the counterfactual is. Do you think that those working right now would have been better off in the pre-gig economy world? I wonder if you might sum up for us why you believe it to be a win-win for both workers and indeed consumers?
I think you've hit on a really important point here. And oftentimes people will look at this new gig economy, this new flexible way of working and say, this is a nightmare because security's out of the window. Far better in the old days where you knew where you stood, you had an agreement with an employer. You didn't tend to change employers very much. I mean, some people would work for the same employer for their entire life. That's sort of gone out of the window, but far better to have that security. If you're an Uber driver and you get sick or you suddenly need to earn much more money, do you start working 140 hours a week? Isn't the stress of all of this flexibility not worth the candle? Well, I've already given you some indication that, pretty much overwhelmingly, I think the workers themselves like that flexibility rather than the straitjacket of a contract. But more important than that, I don't think that you can compare a flexible job in the gig economy with what its old-fashioned traditional working alternative would have been. Because I think these jobs just simply wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the gig economy. The choice is not whether all of these Uber drivers would be black cab drivers. They just wouldn't be driving Ubers. They would be doing something else, presumably less productive to the customer, of a lower earning basis for themselves. It gives them the ability to top up. So I would be extremely cautious about comparing gig economy work and just sort of assuming with the wave of a magic wand by the state, these gig economy jobs could be rendered safe and secure and better paid and sick pay and minimum wage and all of the rest of it. Because if you were to wave that magic wand, I suspect what you actually do is to destroy a vast number of these working opportunities for the people that are seizing them. So be careful about the counterfactual. The counterfactual isn't you can just switch gig jobs into the old-fashioned economy. If you regulate these things too heavily, they disappear entirely. The total amount of work goes down. The total amount of wages earned goes down. And that's not in the interests of the workers or the consumers.
Well, interesting times. We'll see what happens, Mark. Thank you very much. Mark, if people want to learn more about the IEA, where can they do so?
Please go to iea.org.uk. That's our website. Our YouTube channel is IEA London, where there's content going up almost every day, even over the summer months. And that's where you can tune in to the programme that you quite correctly plugged at the top of the show, Darren, Live with Littlewood, which will be coming back in the first week of September. So find out more about us there.
Brilliant. Cheers, Mark.
Thanks, Darren. Good to speak to you.